Thanks for joining us today for Eye on New Mexico. We have almost made it through 2013, and today we'll be looking back at the biggest stories of the year in New Mexico, from the stories that impacted you the most to the ones that just had everyone talking, and in many cases, most cases in fact, stories that got national attention. I'm joined today by Ramirez and Danielle Todesco, both of course reporters and anchors here at KOB. Thanks for making the time to do this, guys.
This is fun.
Yeah, this is fun. It's kind of looking back across the whole year. It's kind of nostalgic.
Yeah, and as reporters and anchors, you both have covered pretty much every story that we'll be talking about today, so it's fun to get that kind of behind-the-scenes perspective. Yeah. Well, let's dive right in. Our first story takes us back to the first month of 2013. Back in January, a 15-year-old boy was accused of killing his father, mother, and 3 of his siblings in the South Valley. His name, Nehemiah Griego, and the crime he's accused of shocked New Mexico and people all over the country, especially just a short time after the school shooting in Newtown, Connecticut. I think that really stood out at the time because this was another case of a young person doing something, accused of doing something so horrific, and it was just after such a horrific incident in Newtown.
It was, and I think people were still, even though Newtown didn't happen near us,
right,
people were still kind of healing and coming off of that, trying to understand, like you said, why
someone would do that.
And then this happens in such a tragedy.
You know, a lot of stories, this one included, a lot of people will say, well, what happened? What's going on? This particular story presents some challenges for us in the media because since we're dealing with a minor, with a juvenile, information doesn't flow as freely when we're talking about juveniles versus when we talk about crimes where adults are the suspect. So this particular story has been challenging for us because we haven't gotten that constant flow of information, and it makes it a little bit more difficult. But we are trying to stay on top of it, but hopefully we'll have some updates in the new year on that one.
Yeah, we have had other young people accused of murder in New Mexico, and you're right, you know, there is that issue of are they going to be charged as an adult or and tried as an adult, and that information is often more slowly flowing.
That's right.
Well, moving on from that, our next story started just before Thanksgiving last year when a young boy disappeared in the Four Corners. Dylan Redwine was last seen at his father's home in Vallecito, Colorado. We covered search after search that turned up nothing until finally in June of this year, Dylan Redwine's remains were found near Vallecito Lake. Still, nobody has been charged in his death. Investigators still can't even say exactly what happened to him. Quite a mystery. Another story that got national attention. This one was covered in Colorado by our Denver affiliate, here in New Mexico. Just a lot of attention on this one.
And this one, as you mentioned, started, it hasn't even happened in the past year. Just a lot of the developments have happened over the past year. And we all kind of, I think, were hoping for the best on this one. And then that news came down that, you know, after the snow melt, as we had talked about yesterday, you know, I can't wait to find out, you know, a big development on that case.
On this story, as soon as we found out that they had found remains of a small child, I got in the air and we launched out to Durango, to where Vallecito is nearby, and the town is talking at the time. Everybody knows the story about Dylan. Everybody has their suspicions about what happened, and as we know, nothing has been confirmed at this point. Nobody has been charged with killing Dylan Redwine. Yeah,
this one was interesting, and I forgot to mention when we discussed the Griego murder story as well, but that story got coverage on Dr. Drew, who has a show on HLN. This one on Dr. Phil. Of course, these sort of talk show hosts take interest in these stories sometimes, not necessarily always for the right reasons. This one, the Dylan Redwine story, has been interesting because of the fight between the parents. Dylan was with his father when he disappeared. His mother and father divorced. She has leveled some accusations against the father. Kind of ugly stuff.
Initially, I think everybody was wondering, you know, what happened with the father here, and I think he has been working to try and clear his name and any accusations against him.
And when you talk to people in the Durango and Farmington and Four Corners area, their suspicions naturally draw to the father, but again, he's never been charged. He's cooperated, as far as we know, with every law enforcement interview. So it's still a huge mystery.
Yeah. And we hope to eventually, as Danielle said, have some developments on that for the family, if nothing else, especially. Well, our next story on our list, every year our top 10 seems to include at least one sports story. And this year, the big news in the sports world back in March, the bombshell announcement that Steve Alford was leaving the Lobos. He was only named head basketball coach in 2007, but he led the Lobo men to some of the team's best seasons. And he had just agreed to a 10-year, multi-million-dollar contract with the Lobos, literally weeks before, when all of a sudden he announced he was taking the top job with UCLA. I was in Denver at the airport and saw this story on ESPN when it broke earlier this year in March.
And so many people, I think people in Albuquerque, all Lobo fans, took this so personally.
Yes.
Like, Steve, how could you leave us? You know, and he was doing so well, and that team is amazing anyway. But after promising, you know, this is my town and I love this place and this is my team, and then to, you know, it was a slap in the face, I think, for a lot of Lobo fans.
And then right out, so once Albuquerque healed, then we immediately started going to, well, who's going to be the next coach? And the fan favorite by leaps and bounds was Noodles, as most people call him. And so there was a lot of speculation. Was Krebs going to hire Noodles or not? You know, at first he said he was going to do some sort of a national search, but I think the response to the assistant coach, who was Steve Alford's assistant coach, was so high. I think UNM really heard those calls and eventually hired Coach Noodles.
Craig Neal.
Craig Neal.
Easily became the coach. No one debated that much. Everyone was really happy. You're right. It didn't take long to heal in some ways. That was a happy follow-up.
Steve Alford.
Nice message there, Chris. Well, the next story may be the most viral video to come out of New Mexico in 2013. The chaotic traffic stop near Taos, in which a state police officer fired shots at the tires of a fleeing minivan. The driver from Tennessee had her 5 children in that van with her. Now, she had already fled from police once before this. She was pulled over. She took off from that stop. She was pulled over again here, and that's when the shots were fired. She was later arrested. And of course, several weeks later, we know the state police officer seen there firing those shots at her tires was fired from his job. So this story happened a lot more recently, but it kind of made our list this year because it went national, it went viral. The video, of course, was everywhere. And people like to talk about this kind of thing. I mean, some people said, no, the cops went way too far. You saw the one bashing out the window. Others, of course, have rallied behind the state cop who was fired, saying he responded appropriately and he shouldn't have lost his job over this.
There is that balance, I think, when we have an obligation to report that this woman was breaking the law or accused of breaking the law. And but she did have some children in her car, and I think a lot of these officers, you know, we hear from the chief, this is a hard decision. How do you approach this, and how do you make sure that this woman is not endangering them, but are they endangering her children? It's such a balance.
It's also a decision that really split New Mexico. You know, a good chunk of people said that officer did the wrong thing because most law enforcement divisions have policies where they can't fire shots. They can't openly fire on somebody unless they're being fired back at or they think their life is being threatened. And so I think when he was fired, the police chief cited that kind of a policy. He definitely broke policy. But then you have a whole separate part of New Mexico who were very vocal about this guy was just doing his job and he was put in that position and he should get his job back. So it's been interesting as a reporter and as a news department to cover both sides of this debate because they've been both so vocal.
You know, this takes us to the other stories that we've covered, and we'll talk a little more about that still to come. But we've covered so many instances of police shootings in New Mexico over the years. This has made our top 10 list every year. Just the story about police overusing of their guns, overstepping their bounds there, and that's why this continues to come up, because we keep seeing instances like this. So.
Yeah, they never, I think we've heard from several of the chiefs, these officers don't know when a situation is going to turn deadly and when they're going to need to use that force. And I think sometimes maybe they're feeling like knee-jerk reaction. You know.
Yeah,
it's hard to put yourself in that position. Yeah,
it's definitely a tough one, and I think what I've been able to appreciate, not just as a journalist working in New Mexico, but I'm also a guy who sits at home and watches the news. The fact that we've moved into this technology where so much of what police do is now recorded, it allows us to make our own decisions about what happened, and so we can sit around and debate.
We make judgments. Yeah,
exactly. Yeah, we can debate whether here's what I think, here's what you think. But what happened was captured on video, and it's clear in broad daylight. And yeah, and that's what's fueling this debate is because everybody has seen the same thing, but they draw different conclusions.
Yeah, that's a great point. And this video was actually several minutes long. You saw the whole exchange with the driver and her children, her teenage son there. You can still see that video out there, obviously, if you want to see the whole thing, if you haven't seen it yet. But yeah, you're right. It does sort of, you can see everything, and obviously you're going to make a judgment on that.
Yeah.
Well, our sixth story on the list today, throughout 2013, our Four on Your Side team, led by Chris Ramirez here, exposed things happening in New Mexico that really shouldn't be happening. And one of the stories that made national headlines were the allegations of abuse at a ranch for teenage boys in southern New Mexico. Chris, in his investigation, spoke with boys who came forward with stories of being shackled and beaten at the Tierra Blanca ranch in Tierra County. The ranch owner, who you saw there, Scott Chandler, denied the allegations, even going on the Today Show to defend his ranch. Chris, I'll start by asking you sort of, you know, this was one of the investigations that you focused the most attention on this year.
Yeah, we spent a lot of time on this, and we broke this story in October. The story got so much attention because we had boys who were teens working and living on this ranch. They were sent there by their parents, who went on camera with us. We didn't disguise their faces. They went on camera. In some cases, we flew them across the country to meet with us here in Albuquerque, and they poured their hearts out to us. And they told us what their own experiences were while living at the Tierra Blanca Ranch. And we did that story. We exposed what happened. We know the very next day after we broke this story, the state went in to remove all the boys that were still living at the ranch, and they were missing. They had totally disappeared. And that prompted one of the largest Amber Alerts in New Mexico history. They were looking for
9 boys.
It was 9, yeah.
The number fluctuated for a while there. Initially it was 13, but I think it boiled down to 9.
And I think what we've learned from this story this year is that we do have some significant loopholes in New Mexico's laws, because a lot of the way the ranch was being operated, so under the grid, really didn't violate any New Mexico laws like we initially thought. They don't consider themselves to be a rehabilitation or a treatment center. They consider themselves to be a wilderness program, and they fully admit that they have no one who's trained to deal with kids with behavioral issues. There's no psychologist. They don't have anybody from the mental health community working with these kids. They don't bill themselves as a therapy-based treatment. They're a wilderness program, and they believe that some tough love, really tough love, will straighten these boys out.
And you've learned of other ranches like this around the country.
There are so many, and I think because the western part of the United States has so much more rural area where people can do things off the grid, there are a lot of them, especially in Colorado, Utah, New Mexico, and Arizona.
And again, it got the national attention. The Today Show had Scott Chandler on talking to him about it, because people were a little bit shocked that this stuff is happening, not just here, but in other states as well.
Yeah, and one more thing on this story. This is a story that we're going to be following in 2014. This story is by no means finished, and Four on Your Side is going to be getting on it pretty aggressively.
All right. That's something to look forward to there, of course. Well, as we count down our stories, the folks at the Weather Channel did our job for us and looked back at the weather of 2013, and they actually gave New Mexico the prize for having the most extreme weather of any state in the country in 2013. Now, there wasn't anything scientific about their choice. They just looked at examples, but we certainly agree here that New Mexico saw a lot of wild weather events. Of course, the exceptional drought, but then this torrential rain and flooding we saw during the summer monsoon from July to September. There was a powerful storm that hit the metro area in late July. Hail that looked like snow, but that's hail that covered Santa Rosa as another example there. The flooding, the fires, the drought. It's always a crazy weather year in New Mexico. Well, our top 4 stories of 2013 are straight ahead. We'll count those down when we come back. Welcome back. We continue to look back on some of the biggest stories of 2013 in New Mexico. Our list, of course, was compiled basically by myself and these 2 individuals here, Chris Ramirez and Danielle Todesco, reporters and anchors. Obviously, a very subjective list. We look back on the year. I usually kind of keep track of the big stories making national news even throughout the year in New Mexico. So you may not agree with all of the stories we chose, but yeah,
I think it's also the stories that we covered repeatedly.
Yeah, exactly.
Especially this next one.
Over and over again.
It is hard to narrow them down. I mean, literally, we do thousands of stories every single year, spread out across all of our newscasts every single day. So to narrow it down to 10 really is a much more daunting job than people probably think.
Absolutely. Well, the next story that stood out to us, here's a name most people in New Mexico probably know by now, Levi Chavez. The former APD officer was accused of killing his wife, Tierra, in 2007, but he didn't go on trial until this year. And boy, was it a trial. This one went on for weeks. Crime scene experts testified, officers who worked on the cases, and of course the mistresses. Several women who had relationships with Levi Chavez took the stand. It all, of course, ended with a not guilty verdict for Chavez. And I have to say that some people were very upset about that verdict. Again, people are judging from the sidelines. They're not on the jury. But people looked at that case and thought, how did he get off?
You know, I was in the trial for most of the trial, a good chunk of it. And then after the trial, I interviewed the jurors, and I asked them the question, why'd you do it? Why couldn't you convict? And their answer to me was there just wasn't the evidence to support it. And we were looking at the same evidence. I was in the media room taking notes. They were in the jury box taking notes. We were looking at the same thing, and I would agree with them. There just wasn't an overwhelming amount of evidence that would suggest that Levi Chavez, without a shadow of a doubt, killed Tierra Chavez.
Yeah, and that's tough. That's a tough place to be in a jury situation. And a lot of jurors actually later, Danielle, I know you spoke to some that said they sort of regretted that they couldn't come to that decision.
I think a lot of people in cases like this want someone to be held accountable for someone's death, and we still, you know, we don't know what happened to Tierra. We don't know if we
weren't there. Yeah, exactly.
And so I think they wanted this to be kind of resolution for the family.
Good point.
But they have to play it safe, and they have to do, you know, if they, as you mentioned, if they don't have the overwhelming evidence, then they cannot convict someone.
The other story within the Levi Chavez story was what was up with all of the mistresses.
It had all the makings of that salacious trial that people, I mean, you know, court TV loves to cover. Yeah, exactly.
And over the years, we've been in courtroom with Levi Chavez, and he's not particularly charming. He's not particularly articulate. So you know, there's been this big mystery of like, what's his draw? How did he get all these women to sort of fall all over him? It's still somewhat of a mystery, even to women who were in the courtroom.
Yeah, and Dateline NBC covered this story. And if you ever watch Dateline, I mean, they're taking the most salacious trials from around the country often, and going back and kind of covering the backstory there. But you know, the fact that they came out and covered this one says something, because they usually gravitate toward these types of stories where there does seem to be a scandal going on.
And like you mentioned, I think this is one that we will continue to see on True TV and Court TV, and it's one of those that people will want to keep rehashing. And
it'll be a Hollywood movie. It's only a matter of time.
It could be. If any story out of New Mexico this year does become one, Well, our next story, certainly a frightening example of the way officers in New Mexico put their lives on the line every day. In late October, Christopher Chase led police and deputies on a chase through Albuquerque, shooting 3 APD officers and a Bernalillo County Sheriff's deputy in the process. Deputy Robin Hopkins is still continuing to recover from her injury. She was the most severely wounded. Now, for years here, as we mentioned, we have talked about the high number of officer-involved shootings in Albuquerque, and then we have a story like this, and it always makes you wonder, what exactly are the cops up against out there? Now, we talked about this a little with the Taos traffic stop, but you look at something like this, a guy going on a shooting rampage around town where civilians could have been wounded, and it's just, you know, what choice do officers have in a situation like this?
This is the most severe case, at least in the past few years, I think, that we've seen of an attack on officers. And I think this...
Since John Hyde.
Yes. Yeah, and I think from what I've spoken to the man who does counseling for a lot of the law enforcement officers, this shook them, every single one of them, and they still the next day have to get back out on the job. And this, you have to feel for them, and you understand kind of where their mind is and what they're going through out there.
And from the information that we've received from APD and BCSO, this was a very thought out and planned out attack on our local law enforcement. And I think that's what struck the nerve of so many people who were just watching our coverage and just kind of tuning in, because this wasn't a random act the way so many of them tend to be.
Good point, yeah.
This was deliberate, and I think that hurts a little bit more.
Yeah, you're absolutely right about that. And you know, we, like you said, John Hyde a few years ago was sort of the most recent attack on law enforcement that we saw. And of course, he also killed 3 other people, 3 civilians, and 2 cops, and they all died. And we were so grateful, of course, after this story that the 3 APD officers and the deputy survived.
Right.
Of course, it was still so hurtful to see, you know, that long recovery for Robin Hopkins. She has a small child at home, and we saw such an outpouring from people. We did a hotline after this story, and it's incredible the way people respond when the law enforcement community is attacked like this.
The other thing, too, that I'll add is that it affected a lot of people because the crime scene literally spanned across the city, from downtown all the way to the North Valley. And so just driving across the city was impacted. And so everybody was tuning in to figure out what had happened.
You're right. I was stuck at 4th and Montano at that exact moment, wondering, this is more than a car crash, you know.
You're right. I remember that day going to a party, actually. It was a Saturday, and I was off, and knowing people were already talking about what's going on. People were seeing stuff and wondering what is going on in this city today. Very scary.
I was in the chopper that day, and so I had more of an aerial perspective, and there was just police officers and crime scene tape everywhere, from the North Valley to downtown. It was incredible.
Well, moving on, our second story, down to the last one on our list. This one also put New Mexico in the national spotlight. We could soon be one of the only states in the entire country with an operational horse slaughterhouse. Valley Meat Company plans to start up operations January 1st after a years-long battle that included several lawsuits and orders preventing them from opening. A federal appeals court finally lifted a temporary restraining order, but then we saw New Mexico's Attorney General file yet another lawsuit just days later. So, of course, this story is ongoing, but very interesting because if they start operating, they will be one of only 2, as we know right now, horse slaughterhouses in the nation since 2007, when the federal government changed the rules on that. Just an interesting story.
It is, and it's one that I think is in our newscasts at least twice a week. It's a constant update.
There's so many updates,
because there has been lawsuit after lawsuit filed, temporary restraining orders, appeals, exactly.
It will be interesting to see if it ever does end up operating.
This is me just probably being ignorant, but I didn't know there was even a market for horse meat
until this.
And then it turns out there's kind of a vibrant market.
In Europe, I believe, is kind of where we've seen a lot of the cases.
The owner of Valley Meat says he has contracts set up for Belgium, Russia, and China. So very, very interesting, and that it's happening right here in New Mexico. So. Well, let's go ahead and get to our top story of the year. Politicians and same-sex couples have long fought for the right of gay couples to marry in our state, and it was only last week that the state Supreme Court finally decided that yes, gay couples should be able to marry in New Mexico. Now, this is a story that made national news well before 2013. Before we discuss it, I want to look at one New Mexico couple's story that Danielle did.
For me, it was love at first sight.
Their love story could redefine marriage in New Mexico.
To be my lawful wedded spouse.
Angelique Newman and Jen Roper met in college 22 years ago. They've been together ever since. They bought a house, they adopted 3 children, but haven't been able to marry. They tried back in 2004 when Sandoval County's clerk started issuing licenses to same-sex couples.
We were third in line when they stopped it.
But today, no one stopped it. In fact, people stepped in to make it happen. A judge showed up. They were handed bouquets of roses, and in the middle of the St. Vincent Cancer Center in Santa Fe, they exchanged their vows.
I be wed until death do us part.
Roper has brain cancer. She believes that her illness has helped move the issue of same-sex marriage forward in our state, but she hopes that momentum doesn't stop.
Because I'm sick right now, there seems to be some reason to give it some extra support. The only thing I can think of that is let it go. Just let it go and support whoever wants it.
And sadly, of course, Jen Roper passed away after this story aired and did not make it to see the historic decision by the state Supreme Court.
And they talked about her yesterday. She was a big part of this movement. Her illness was also driving it forward, making
she was a part of the lawsuit.
Giving it more of a deadline. Right, she was a huge part of the lawsuit. And the ACLU held a press conference yesterday, and they talked about dedicating this victory to her and Angelique and their 3 boys, and hoping that at least this is something to make them feel like it wasn't for nothing.
Yeah.
It'll be interesting now to see how New Mexico starts implementing the tentacles of this law. How are we going to do taxation, and can we file? And you know, we have all these other county clerks around the state that need to sort of fall in line now. So I know that's something that I'm sure we'll be covering in the months to come.
Absolutely, the story isn't over, but interesting how it seemed to have sort of wrapped up right at the end of the year.
Yeah.
Well, thank you, Danielle and Chris, for joining me to talk about the top 10 stories of the year, and thank you for watching. We'll see you next Sunday for another Eye on New Mexico.